You're listening to Florida Matters. I'm Matthew Petty. In his first month back in the White House, President Trump has moved quickly to roll out restrictions on immigration and stop diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. And he's turned to a key ally from the 2024 election campaign, billionaire Elon Musk, to slash jobs and federal spending. There's an avalanche of news out of Washington, and you may be struggling to keep up and figure out how it might affect you and your neighbors across the Tampa Bay region. Coming up, you'll hear from two people who've been paying close attention to US foreign and domestic policy for years. Jeh Johnson was the US Department of Homeland Security Secretary during President Obama's second term. He's keenly aware of the challenge of securing the country's borders, and he shares some insights about this new administration's approach to immigration. But first, a conversation with Frank Langfitt, who spent nearly 2 decades as a foreign correspondent, reporting from China, the UK, and Ukraine, to name just a few places. Now he's back in this country, filing stories as NPR's roving national correspondent. Recently, Langfitt was at the St. Petersburg Conference on World Affairs, and that's where he sat down with Florida Matters at WUSF St. Petersburg studio to talk about what it's like to come back and report on a United States that feels like a very different country after 18 years abroad. And just a note, Willie Radowski, the organizer of the Conference on World Affairs, is a longtime supporter of WUSF. Well, Frank, thank you so much for sitting down and chatting with us. Appreciate that. You've reported on Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Brexit, Chinese President Xi Jinping's first term. How has all of your foreign correspondence experience prepared you for what you're reporting on now as a roving reporter? You're covering stories all across this country.
You know, I think what's different is I was overseas for 18 years. So when I come back to the United States, I think I see this more as a foreigner and as a foreign correspondent. So my story selection, I'm covering it the way you would if you weren't actually raised here. So what I'm looking for is these sort of smaller micro stories that tell us a great deal about America at this moment. And so those are the kinds of stories that I'm pursuing, the same kinds of stories that you pursue if you're a foreign correspondent, because you're looking for stories that will kind of explain where we are in very human terms. And so in some ways, it's a terrific transition because I'm using all these skills that I used in China, Africa, Europe, and applying them back here in the United States.
Because a lot of what you were doing, whether you were in China or the UK or elsewhere, is you were trying to talk to people on the street, like really get that kind of granular view of
absolutely.
Things. And is that your sort of default reporting position now?
It is. I mean, I've always been a field reporter. And I also think that the medium that you and I are in, it's a warm medium. And what is its greatest strength? The ability to bring people's voices to listeners so they can understand people's lives. But then to be able to step back, of course, and say, what does this tell us about this moment in history? What does this tell us about this country? And this country could be Kenya, it could be Somalia, it could be Myanmar. But I'm applying all those skills to this new beat, obviously at a very interesting time in the United States.
Yeah, we are at kind of an inflection point, it seems, in American democracy. And thinking about that, I mean, you've witnessed democracies in other countries at moments of profound change and upheaval. Brexit is probably a good example of that. What are some questions Americans should be asking as they try and make sense of the political changes that this country is going through?
Well, I think one of the things they should be asking at this moment is, what is the meaning of the rule of law? I mean, right now there are challenges to what the administration is doing. USAID is a great example of basically going in and shutting down the vast majority of what they're doing. I was on the phone this morning to USAID recipients in Thailand who are helping people, journalists in Burma. And I think people should be asking, how much power does a president have in a democracy where the founders very carefully set out a system where the 3 branches of government would compete and check each other. And right now it's the courts. We're not seeing anything really much from Congress. The Republicans are not raising objections. They're supportive of the president. And the Democrats are in disarray. So I think people should think very carefully about what kind of form of government they have and whether that's being followed or not. And that's dry stuff. I mean, there was a recent poll that I heard that we covered at NPR in which people were very supportive of the president, and I think they liked him being a man of action and getting a lot of things done, but they also didn't really know whether what he was doing was legal or not. in terms of particularly what he's done at USAID.
The United States is politically divided right now more than ever, and your reporting covers how that plays out in places of worship, political rallies. What's your approach to covering these polarizing issues?
I mean, what I try to do, and what I did overseas, it's often, you probably found the same thing in your work, ask open-ended questions. Don't try to corner people, just ask them, and then also see what the basis of the facts are, what they think the facts are, and then to the degree that you can as a journalist determine what the facts are so that you know that. But I think it's really, really important, I think this is so obvious, is you need to move around a lot and you need to go into all kinds of different communities and talk to lots of different kinds of people. And I think that's very, very important. The conversations that you would hear inside the Beltway in places like Chevy Chase and Bethesda, the northwest suburbs of Washington, are dramatically different than you would find in Western Maryland or on the Eastern Shore, so you don't have to go very far. And I see my job as just going into a lot of these places and just asking a lot of open-ended questions. And that is very helpful. And I'm a little bit of an advantage of that being an older white male, because I can kind of float around, and that makes it easier. I had that advantage to some degrees, not because I was an older white male, but as an American in some parts overseas, because people were curious about America, they'd be happy to talk to me.
Mm-hmm. I imagine you might have experienced the opposite too. Like, as an American, you might have felt a little exposed in some places.
Yeah, you always have to, talk about polarization. I can remember December a year ago getting off the airplane in Ben Gurion Airport to cover, the war in Gaza and what was happening in Israel in the West Bank. And the first person I met turned to me and said, "Whose side are you on?" I hadn't even gotten in a taxi to go into Tel Aviv.
Thinking about facts, though, and this is a conversation that we've had on the show that I host, Florida Matters, and in our newsroom during the course of covering last year's election, the 2024 presidential election, like trying to figure out what those facts are and where people sort of stand on facts seems to have gotten harder and harder, right? Because on the one hand, you have a kind of an all-out assault from people who are trying to have people see things a certain way and say, look, your accepted basis of fact is no longer valid. This is what you should be thinking about. On the other hand, there's kind of technological challenges too, like with AI and sort of digital manipulation of things. So how does that kind of change what you do? Because this is a different world we're in from 20 years ago, 18 years ago.
Yeah, you know what my answer is? Go there. See it for yourself. That's why I'm on the road all the time and why I was on the road overseas, to go and be an eyewitness and see what's happening and talk to people in front of each other. You probably already know this, but apparently in the United States among some journalists, and this was true, I think, among human beings, they spend so much time during COVID on Zoom that they don't interact that much. And I'm always just getting on planes and jumping in my car and going places. And as a journalist, you learn 10 times more when you just go to a place and you sit down and talk to people and you look them in the eye. Because also it's much harder for them to disregard your questions or, dehumanize or think that you're the other in some fashion when they're sitting right across from you in a coffee shop. Mm-hmm. That's part of how I do what I do. And I find it because in the United States, people mix less and less, and we know the political geography of the country. To me, the best thing that I can do is get out there and just travel and talk. One of the reasons I'm here for an event is because I've never been to St. Petersburg. So I said, yeah, I'll come. And I'm actually interviewing people here. I never stop. And I'm talking to interesting people that I wouldn't get if I were just in DC.
So this is a different country from the one that you were last reporting in as a US-based
yes.
reporter.
Yeah. So I left during the first Obama administration, 2010, and I returned in 2023, having been based in Africa, China, and in London and working in Europe. And it's dramatically different. The country I left, there was an agreement on facts. That's no longer the case. It was polarized, but not remotely like the way that it is now. And then I think distrust of institutions and media could be included in that is dramatic. Now, of course, a lot of that is by design. As reporters, we all make mistakes, but there's also opportunism here, and that people, very specifically, want to undermine our credibility because we're actually reporting the facts. And those facts are, they don't work in the favor of the people who are trying to undermine our credibility. One thing I found really interesting, I'll just make a comparison, because a great fortune I've had working overseas is to be able to do comparative politics, like on the ground, because you see it. Boris Johnson, the former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, tried to erode the checks and balances in the UK when I was there. And I thought, he might have been relatively successful, but then I decided to do an audit. And I looked at all the things he did. And what I found is that there was pushback everywhere. And in fact, he was largely defeated. Well, why was that? One is that people had the courage of their convictions in the United Kingdom. In fact, there was a general shared value, and there was shared values. So everyone agreed that the things that he was trying to do were not good for democracy in the United Kingdom. And the other thing is there was a shared agreement on facts. You have a polarized press. The British, conservative tabloids are quite something. But everybody knew what the facts were. And we don't have that in the United States.
Why
and
is
that
that?
is a big difference. That's another conversation. Let's go back to Newt Gingrich. Let's go back to the early 90s. I worked on Capitol Hill in the 90s when things became very polarized, and also when the politics became, really attack politics. And certainly the change in media. There was a general consensus when there were just a few major newspapers and, 3 television networks. It's obviously an utterly different landscape. But I learned a lot covering the United Kingdom and then coming back to the United States. And those are 2 big differences. They're generally shared values in the UK, and there's an agreement on facts.
Now, you wrote a book based on your experience driving a free taxi service around Shanghai. And in this country, in the United States, China is often portrayed as like a political and economic foe. When you spoke to Chinese people in your reporting, in your just daily life, how did Chinese see America when you were there?
So that's a moving target, because I first started reporting in China in 1997, and I've seen a dramatic change in attitudes towards the United States. In the late 90s, the United States was at peace. It was running budget surpluses. Clinton was in office, and people in China were amazed. How do you guys keep doing this? Decade after decade, you're on top. Your economy is in great shape. And remember, at that point, the Chinese economy was about the size of Italy's. It was just as things were taking off. What changed is the Iraq War made people think, why, how could you make a mistake like this and invade a country on false pretenses? And then the global financial crisis. Now, you remember, the West was often lecturing China on how to manage its finances. And then the United States created the global financial crisis through all kinds of terrible mismanagement, to say the least. So by 2010, the Chinese were tired of being lectured, with good reason, by the United States. They had a point. And I think that attitudes really changed. Also, at the same time, the Chinese economy was growing very rapidly. So Chinese were now traveling around the world. They had a lot more money. They had a lot more self-confidence.
Just to wrap things up here, Frank, since you've taken on the national correspondent beat, what's an issue or story you think needs more attention, and what's something that's really stuck with you?
So that's great. I'm trying to figure out what to do next. I've got a list of things. One, right now I'm focusing on USAID, so it's a little more overseas in terms of that. I think what I've been gravitating towards, and I suppose this is obvious, are places and events that are microcosms of what's happening. So recently I covered a church where the minister was pushed out after complaints about too many progressive sermons and focusing on social and racial justice. But I did 8 to 10 hours of interviews, and I went there, and it's a very complex story. And I think that's one example. There's a murder case in Kentucky where I used to work in the coal fields, and there's a big story, but it's been largely overlooked. And so I think I want to go into these parts of America where most people don't get to go, where something actually very interesting is happening and is being overlooked, and then finding a way to bring that all to life so that people come away saying, when they hear the story, I didn't know that, and I now feel like I understand my country just a little bit better.
Well, Frank Langfitt, NPR roving national correspondent, focusing on stories about democracy, economics, politics, and culture that illuminate a changing America. Thanks so much for sitting down and sharing some of your insights. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Matthew.
You're listening to Florida Matters. Coming up, Jeh Johnson was the Secretary of Homeland Security during President Obama's second term, and he knows just how tough it is to manage border security and how controversial immigration policy can be. He has thoughts on the potential and the pitfalls facing this new administration as the White House clamps down on immigration. You're listening to Florida Matters. I'm Matthew Petty. During the 2024 election campaign, immigration dominated news headlines, and it came up time and time again as one of the things people told WUSF they were worried about in the lead up to the election. At the start of February, Florida Matters stopped by the Church of the Palms, a Presbyterian church in Sarasota, where Jeh Johnson had been invited to give a talk by the Sarasota Institute of Lifetime Learning. Johnson led the Department of Homeland Security during President Obama's second term, and before his talk, he sat down with us to share some insights on what makes immigration and border security so challenging. By the time we packed up our recording equipment, the church's sprawling parking lot was full, one sign that interest in the issue remains high as the Trump administration rolls out tough new immigration policies. Well, Jeh Johnson served as Secretary of Homeland Security in the Obama administration from 2013 to 2017. Before that, he served as General Counsel for the Department of Defense and General Counsel for the Department of the Air Force. One of the responsibilities of the Secretary of Homeland Security is managing the borders, and border security is particularly polarizing no matter who's in the White House, but immigration was a key part of the 2024 election campaign, and in his second term, President Donald Trump has renewed efforts to crack down on illegal immigration. Is illegal immigration a bigger problem for the United States now than it was, say, during President Obama's second term?
I would say that the numbers on a monthly basis of crossings on our southern border with Mexico are larger, greater than they were 10 years ago because of the push factors. The push factors are what drive illegal immigration, frankly. The push factors always overwhelm whatever defenses you can put up on our southern border. And in the last several years, those push factors have been exacerbated by corruption, drought, famine, poverty. And so I've said now for a very long time, after owning this problem for 37 months, to deal with the problem of our southern border effectively, we as a nation have to address the underlying push factors through sustained, smart investment in improving the economies, the integrity of the governments in the countries where people are fleeing. It's also the case that since 10 years ago, there are more countries contributing to this issue. On my watch, it was principally Mexico, Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. Now it's also Venezuela, Cuba, Haiti, and nations from other hemispheres. But again, in order to effectively deal with this problem, you have to address the problem at the source. Many people don't want to hear that. They want smart, quick answers. They want to see on nightly television raids, people being snatched up, deported. But so long as the push factors persist, families, mothers are going to make the basic choice with their children to flee a burning building.
We are sitting down and talking in the Church of the Palms in Sarasota, and places of worship, schools, medical facilities had been pretty much off limits to immigration and customs enforcement agents under the Biden administration. That's no longer the case. What impact do you see that having on the landscape of immigration enforcement?
I'll answer your question this way. When I was Secretary of DHS, I used to tell our immigration enforcement people, including Tom Homan, by the way, who worked for ICE when I was Secretary of the whole DHS, do your jobs, enforce the law, but one controversial incident in a particular community can undermine your entire mission. What do I mean by that? Snatch a grandmother off a church steps one Sunday, or pull a child out of junior high school who's undocumented in front of the cameras and that will become a highly controversial single incident that could undermine your ability to work effectively in the communities where you need local law enforcement support. So be smart about it. Let's focus on the criminals, focus on the public safety threats. You have to have priorities in the enforcement of our immigration laws. And this administration, at this moment, seems to be doing that by focusing on convicted felons.
On the politics of it too, Secretary Johnson, it seems to me like it doesn't matter who's in charge in the White House and who's managing the borders, there's always going to be some kind of controversy around it. Like, I mean, in the case of Trump's first administration, the family separation policy was very controversial. When you were leading the Department of Homeland Security, the expansion of family detention centers, that was controversial. So it seems like it's a tough job to do at the best of times, and whatever your intentions are.
Immigration policy and enforcement was the most controversial government policy that I dealt with in my public service, and I dealt with a few of them. There is, however, a smart way to navigate this issue. If you could take the politics out of it, there are answers to our broken immigration system. We can and we should secure the border, reduce the numbers of illegal crossings. I believe Americans are entitled to believe that their government can secure its perimeter. But we can also be fair and humane to people who have been here for years, undocumented, who've committed no crimes, who have children who are U.S. citizens, who want to be accountable, who want the opportunity to work, get on the books, pay taxes. These are people who have become de facto Americans. And let's give people an opportunity to also come out of the shadows. There are something probably at this point well in excess of 11, 12, 15 million undocumented people living in this country now. And let's give them a chance to get on the books. If they've committed no crimes or no public safety threats, they're your neighbor living up the street, there's somebody who has a job that you're familiar with, give them an opportunity to be accountable. There are a number of ways we can fix our broken immigration system that would be attractive to both the right and the left, and it's not impossible if we could somehow take the overheated politics out of the issue. And I'd like to add, Donald Trump has an opportunity here to actually achieve what we were just talking about, comprehensive immigration reform. He's got his base solidly in his hand. And so a great president, an adept politician in his situation would actually kind of move to the center and bring along some Democrats on a comprehensive plan. We've seen presidents in the past do this. Ronald Reagan, for example, Richard Nixon, for example. Move to the center, bring about a bipartisan coalition for some real fundamental change. And he'd have bragging rights. He could claim, I did something that my predecessors, Democrat and Republican, were unable to do.
What are the chances of that happening, though, realistically?
Unfortunately, I don't believe, frankly, that it's in his political makeup to do that. He's had numerous opportunities to do something similar to that.
Sure. I wanted to just ask too about Venezuelans. There's temporary protected status that's set to end in April. That will affect about 300,000 Venezuelan migrants who fled to the US from the Maduro regime. And Florida has a large Venezuelan population. Some of them have told NPR that they feel betrayed by this, and there's been a lot of pushback from South Florida Venezuelan communities as well. What do you make of the rollback of TPS for that group of people?
I'm not surprised. Temporary protected status is temporary. We tend to extend it for, I forget what the period of months is, 18 months or whatever it is. And there's a rollover effect to it over time. But it can be rolled back at a moment's notice by a president. And so this is another reason why we need comprehensive immigration reform to give people an opportunity who've been living here for years and years on a temporary status and an uncertain legal status to come out of the shadows, get on the books, pay taxes, and be accountable.
Secretary Johnson, the Department of Homeland Security, or the Secretary of Homeland Security, has a pretty broad portfolio, right? It's not just border security, it's also counterterrorism, cybersecurity, disaster response.
Secret Service,
And-
aviation security, maritime security.
Right.
I could give you a few more if you like.
Yeah, so there's thousands and thousands of folks that would be working under your oversight.
250,000, yes.
Indeed. Now, right now, the new administration is making some pretty profound changes to the federal government. There's kind of a two-parter to this question. First of all, what do you think the biggest threats are that the new secretary will have to face? And secondly, is this country well positioned, given what's going on administratively, to face those threats?
Well, in my judgment, the biggest homeland security threats to our nation are, and this may surprise you a little bit, global warming, climate change. You can see the effects of that right here in this community in Sarasota, Florida. As I was riding in, I noticed the distressed, dying trees and a dysfunctional government unable to address our long-term problems. My judgment, those are the two biggest threats to our homeland security. DHS is responsible for a wide range of threats. We listed them a moment ago. Invariably, the person at the top, the secretary, spends a lot of her time on immigration policy and enforcement. Let's hope that's not to the exclusion of cybersecurity, aviation security, maritime security, making sure the Secret Service is adequately funded and staffed, making sure that FEMA is adequately funded and staffed to deal with disaster relief, severe weather events. The Department of Homeland Security, you alluded to this, feels very big. In reality, it's only a fraction of the size of the Department of Defense. But because it has this wide range of missions, it feels big. The job of the Secretary is to make sure that the component heads of all these different missions are doing their jobs and that they're adequately funded, and focus where focus is necessary from time to time.
Well, Jeh Johnson, I want to thank you for your time, Secretary of Homeland Security during the President Obama's second term. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
That's Florida Matters for this week. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and watch on YouTube. Florida Matters executive producer is Grayson Doctor. I'm Matthew Petty. Thanks for listening.